everyone, and thank you for joining us for NAA's first ever Industry Roundtable. Thanks again for joining us, whether you're joining us from Zoom or with Facebook Live. I'm Nicole Upano, Director of Public Policy for NAA, and I'm here to help lead you through today's program. So just to get through a couple of housekeeping items first, please remember that you can submit your questions anytime during the session via Zoom's Q&A feature or through Facebook's comment section, and we'll try to get through as many of those as possible. So we have a great panel of speakers today. I want to thank each one of them for taking the time to share their insights. And Aisha, would you mind starting us off with intros?
Absolutely. So my name is Aisha Beverly, and I'm Assistant Vice President of Legal at NAA.
Great, thank you, Aisha. And Jody?
Hi, I'm Jody Applewhite. I'm the Manager of Public Policy at NAA.
Great. Well, before we get to the meat of the program, I just wanted to share a little bit about the National Apartment Association and the rental housing industry. So as it stands today, there are 40.1 million Americans who live in rental homes. That equates to 1 in 3 Americans who rent currently. The rental housing industry supports 17.5 million jobs and contributes much more to the US economy and the many communities that our members, the industry serves across the country. This equates to about 400 billion in tax payments and 69 billion with a B, in renovations and repairs to the nation's housing stock. So just to put some of that into perspective, as Aisha and Jody share today. NAA, for our part, we are the leading voice for the rental housing industry. We're the industry's leading federal advocate. And we also serve as a resource to industry professionals for education, networking, and career advancement opportunities. NAA represents 93,000 members across the country. That's 10 million units globally. And last but not least, we work hand in hand with our 151 state and local apartment associations across the country. So you may be asking yourself why we're here. Great question. So the roundtable is a series of conversations, this being the first, just to educate folks on the critical issues that are affecting the rental housing industry. And it's part of our ongoing effort to just reach a broader audience. So today we're going to talk about the costs of regulation on the rental housing industry. In particular, we're going to talk about pandemic-related emergency mandates, these sort of drastic measures that were intended to be temporary that are now seeming almost semi-permanent, like the federal eviction moratorium, and the major federal stimulus efforts, like the $46 billion in federal rental assistance that's now starting to flow through state and local programs. So we want to talk about how these housing policies may have a long-term impact on the industry. And if you're listening today, chances are you're a renter yourself, you know what it's like to be a renter, or you work for the industry and know, everything it takes to manage rentals or both. And this session is really intended to just help you put into context how these changes that we're seeing to housing policy would impact your housing costs, impact housing affordability overall, and the industry's ability to remain viable over the long term. We want to continue our members' efforts, to provide housing across the country and support the communities that we continue to serve. Okay, so moving into our first topic, before I do that, I just want to say again, if you have any questions, please feel free to put that into the Zoom Q&A box or in Facebook's comment section. So Aisha, thank you again for joining us to talk about the federal eviction moratorium. I know that's top of mind for many housers across the country. And just to set the stage a little bit for our attendees, could you tell us what an eviction moratorium is and where NAA stands on it?
Absolutely. So today we're going to be talking about the federal eviction moratorium specifically. And so that's the CDC's order. And the CDC's order prohibits the eviction of covered residents for the non-payment of rent, provided that that resident submits a declaration to the landlord to invoke the protection of the CDC order. Generally, NAA believes that eviction moratoriums are not the correct policy solution. And as a result of eviction moratoria, both residents and housing providers alike are faced with unsurmountable debt because the moratoriums do not address the root cause of the issue. And the root cause of the issue is the financial instability that many are facing as a result of the pandemic. NAA's advocacy efforts have been focused on policies that keep residents in their homes. And you can only do that by providing direct rental assistance. And I won't go too far into that because I don't want to steal the show from my colleague Jody, who will be speaking on that later.
Well, thank you, Aisha. I know that there's been a lot of talk about the ruling out of DC that just happened. Could you just talk a little bit about that, the eviction moratorium case?
Yes, absolutely. So that's the Alabama Association of Realtors case. And last week, a federal judge in DC sided with the Alabama Association of Realtors, ruling that the CDC's order was unlawful. The judge ruled ultimately that the government exceeded its legal authority in implementing the order. And so it vacated set the order aside.
So if I understand this correctly, I know the Alabama Realtors Association and Georgia Realtors Association, they were plaintiffs in the case. I'm sure they wanted to see, some relief for their members, but there's actually a national impact. Is that right?
That's correct, Nicole, spot on. So the interesting thing in this case is that the government actually asked the court to restrict its opinion, its judgment to the plaintiffs in the case, which were the Alabama Association of Realtors and the Georgia Association as well. However, the court denied this request. And as a result, the order has a nationwide impact.
Yeah, so if not for that temporary stay, there would be an immediate effect on all eviction cases then.
Correct. So same day the order came out, the government, which is the defendant in this case, immediately appealed. The government also requested a temporary administrative stay. And in plain terms, that just means they asked for the court to put its order on pause while the appeals process plays out. And as we know, the government granted that request and the CDC order is still in effect. Just last week as well, the plaintiffs in the case did file a motion in opposition to the government's request for the temporary administrative stay. And so, like I said, we're just waiting for the court to rule on that motion as well.
Well, thanks, Aisha. I know that, for a lot of housing providers who are feeling the pain right now, that's probably promising news. So there are actually several federal cases right now at play. So wondering if you could kind of speak to those and where those stand.
Right. So in total, we've seen 6 cases challenging the CDC order, basically since we've seen the order implemented last September. As of lately, I believe March, we're starting to see those cases rule in favor of housing providers. So we currently have 5 orders basically saying that the CDC exceeded its authority in implementing the eviction moratorium. And with that, those cases are Turkle out of Texas, Skyworks out of Ohio, Tiger Lily out of Tennessee. We also saw the 6th Circuit rule in Tiger Lily denying the government's motion for an emergency stay as well. And so each of these cases are currently being appealed in their respective appellate circuit.
So just to clear up maybe some confusion for our viewers out there, does this have any effect on the state or local moratoria that are also in place?
The cases we're speaking about, particularly today, do not have an effect on state eviction moratoria across the country. If you recall, the CDC's order does not apply in jurisdictions where there is currently a local eviction moratorium order in place that provides the same or a greater level of protection than the CDC's order. So these cases truly only apply to the federal eviction order.
So, what do all these cases point to? I know the federal eviction moratorium is set to expire on June 30th. What does that say about if this has legs to continue standing?
Right. And so we're starting to see the scales tip in favor of housing providers. And the trend I'm noticing in the most recent decisions, that are stating that the order is unlawful or invalid or unconstitutional, is the courts are really starting to focus on the language of the Public Health Services Act and whether that language actually authorizes the CDC to implement this order. And many courts are, like I said, we're beginning to see a trend where the courts are siding with housing providers and saying that the CDC did not have the legal authority to implement the eviction moratorium.
Well, thank you, Aisha. I think this is really helpful and helps us sort of transition to our next topic, which is rental assistance and focusing on more sustainable policy. As Aisha were just kind of discussing, we, NAA, for our part, we're really focused on sustainable solutions that both keep renters stably housed, but also acknowledge that, housing providers need to have enough money to pay their bills. That's why NAA has been such strong supporters of robust investment, federal investment in rental assistance. So Jody, could you tell us a little bit more about, it's now 46 billion that's in federal funds that are now flowing through state and local programs? Is that right?
Sure, yes, that's correct. So since the start of COVID, NAA has continuously advocated for an allocation of funding dedicated solely to emergency rental assistance. In December of 2020, Congress passed the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021, which included $25 billion in emergency rental assistance. That money is being flowed through the Coronavirus Relief Fund, which is managed by the U.S. Department of Treasury. And that fund was created in the CARES Act earlier in 2020. And once the new Congress and the new administration were sworn in, lawmakers went to work on another stimulus bill, the American Rescue Plan Act, which was signed into law in March. And in that bill, we were successful in getting an additional $21.6 billion in emergency rental assistance, which was just made available last Friday.
Well, thanks, Jody. I know that will help, plug the gap of what's now billions of dollars in, rental debt that's accumulated last year and into the first quarter this year. So in terms of those programs, how's it going so far?
Well, since the allocation, there are over 300 programs distributing the funding at a state and local level. And some states have one uniform program, while others have spread out their money over many localities, which has created some challenges as each locality has different requirements and ultimately results in a multi-level process for housing providers. So it ends up taking a lot more time and manpower to manage each program as a housing provider, which ultimately causes delays.
So it sounds like coordination and communication between the renter and the housing provider is really key to that multi-level process. Is that right?
Right. Yes, Nicole. Communication is key in the application process between both parties. So it's important for renters to partner with their housing provider during the application process. A number of documents are required to be submitted by the housing provider, such as tax identification information, rent ledgers, banking information for the online payments. And if renters let their housing provider know that they're applying for the assistance, a housing provider can be proactive and submit all of the information needed to speed up the process and ensure that all their arrearages are paid.
Well, thanks, Jody. You've got a really good view of the landscape across the country. Is there anything states or local programs can do to improve their rental assistance programs just to get this money out more quickly?
Yes, I would say streamlining the application process to make it as simple as possible is a great way to get the funds distributed quickly. So one example of this is for grantees to allow for self-certification of applicants when it comes to showing financial eligibility or financial hardship for eligibility. Treasury strongly encourages grantees to rely on self-certification of applicants regarding whether their financial hardship meets the eligibility requirements. So if a renter meets the eligibility requirements with the first allocation of funding, they will meet the requirements for the second allocation of funding, as the eligibility requirements for the second tranche of funding is a much broader range. So definitely just streamlining the process and making sure that applicants can self-certify.
Well, that's great to hear. I was going to ask you, are there any states or localities that are doing particularly well, kind of incorporating these best practices?
Yes, there are two state programs that come to mind. That would be Virginia and Colorado. These programs have clear eligibility and application processes and allow a seamless process for housing providers to work on behalf of the residents to obtain the relief. One key procedure of the Virginia Rent Relief Program is allowing management companies to apply on behalf of a resident with their consent. The program approval process takes approximately 45 days with payment received within 15 days. So it results in an approximate 60-day turnaround. Another contributing factor to the program's success is the centralized program rather than the patchwork of localities administering the program. So it allows companies to apply easily on behalf of their residents and according to one set of rules rather than all of the differing ones in different localities. And another important factor in the program's success is the communication that the Virginia Housing Development Authority has had with the applicants and the residents. It's been a key part in their success in ensuring the smooth application process for all parties involved. Similarly, in Colorado, they allow the housing providers to begin the process. So once the owner operator submits their portion of the application, program administrators then send an email to the resident for the individual to complete the rest of the application. So the housing provider-led submissions speed up the process significantly. As I said previously, as many programs require tax identification documents from the housing providers, as well as rent ledgers, lease agreements, and the providers can go ahead and submit all of that information on behalf of the resident to help speed that up.
Yeah, Jody, thanks for that. I know that's probably particularly helpful. I know some cities or counties got their own money, but if you're a resident, you don't know if you're supposed to contact the city, the county. Having a state program that has very clear eligibility and application requirements, that must make the process a lot more seamless.
Yes, definitely.
So, just tell me a little bit more about, switching gears a little bit, sorry. So the Treasury released updated guidance last week. Is that something you could speak to and talk a little bit about any notable takeaways for you?
Yes. So like you said, last Friday, Treasury did allocate the additional $21.6 billion that was passed in March. And it's being referred to as ERA2, which is Emergency Rental Assistance 2. So with the new funding came new guidance. The new guidance removes a number of barriers that the rental housing industry has called out, such as prohibiting programs who receive the funding from denying assistance to eligible residents solely because they reside in federally assisted housing. So this ensures that the nation's most vulnerable renters remain stably housed. Additionally, the new guidance establishes an online hub of local emergency rental assistance programs links to make it easier for renters and housing providers to find their programs in their area and find out how to apply. There are a few problematic additions to the guidance and as it relates to ERA2. So for the ERA2 programs, they are to offer direct to resident assistance first and immediately. So they're not requiring programs to go to housing providers beforehand, which is in the law in the funding that was passed for the ERA1. However, if a ERA2 grantee chooses to seek the cooperation of housing or utility providers before providing assistance directly to residents, Treasury strongly encourages that the grantees apply the same rules, same requirements as they did in the ERA1. So NAAs, and we want to encourage all of our members and affiliates to reach out to their state and local programs and encourage the grantees to choose to continue to seek their cooperation and ensure that the direct payments to housing providers continue.
Yeah, I know everyone's certainly grateful for that second tranche of money. We just want to make sure there's not more requirements and everything sort of more seamless.
Right, we want to make it as easy as possible, right. And not, take up more time coming up with more rules and changing everything around, and just make it as easy as possible for everyone involved.
Yeah, I know we already talked about this has been, a lifesaver to a lot of housing providers and renters and plugging up that billion-dollar hole from last year. I just saw that the Mortgage Bankers Association said just for the first quarter that rental housing providers are out $8 billion. So,
wow.
It really is so important for residents to apply and get the rental assistance they need. Do you have any sort of tips or tricks to help people navigate all of this?
As far as tips or tricks, I would say continue to work this would be for renters, continue to work with your housing provider. They want to work with you and help you by either setting up a payment plan or assist in your application process for rental assistance. So being open and communicative with your housing provider about your situation is the best tip that I can give. Rental assistance is so important because it goes towards, maintaining America's housing stock. So rental housing is a small margin business. Only 10 cents of every dollar is actually considered profit. So 38 cents of every dollar goes to paying a mortgage, 14 cents of every dollar goes to property tax, 16 cents to operating expenses, 10 cents to payroll, and 12 cents to capital expenses. So it's a critical for arrearages to be paid so housing providers can be able to afford to pay their bills and maintain their properties and keep them safe and affordable for their residents.
Well, I know we're trying to do a lot, NAA, in terms of helping housing providers and residents get this out quickly and efficiently, but what else are we doing? If you wanted to share
Sure. Yeah. On top of our advocacy with the administration and Congress, we have a lot of materials on rental assistance on our website. We have a COVID-19, 50 state map with links to each program that residents and housing providers can easily access to learn more about how to apply for rental assistance. Be sure to follow us on social media. We publish articles on any administrative changes that may happen on federal level as it relates to rental assistance. We're always putting out materials for folks to stay up to date on what's the latest. And, we continue to advocate on behalf of the industry for any changes in the guidance to streamline the process for the grantees to make sure the money flows quickly to the renters and housing providers.
Well, thank you, Jody, for tying all that up with a nice bow. We did actually get a question for you. So
Sure.
With ERA2, the assistance will go directly to the resident and not the housing provider. I want to be sure I got that correct, or that's what our viewer said.
Sure. So it gives the grantee the option if they want to change their rules and put that into place. I know some grantees in ERA1 weren't allowing, if the housing provider decides not to participate, they weren't allowing the money to go to the renter. So that was included for the grantees to add that to for ERA2. Like I said before, Treasury, if the grantee decides to continue to seek the cooperation of a housing provider, they just have to apply the same rules as ERA1, but it does have to be an option that the money can go to the renter.
Well, thanks, Jody. I know things are still really fluid right now. And again, these are federal grants that are going to state and local programs, and they have a lot of leeway in how the eligibility and everything, how that sort of shakes out. So maybe something that could be helpful, we just updated the rental assistance portion of our website. We might put a link in the chat. Maybe that would help people kind of get a link to who really has the final say.
Sure, I'll be sure to add that.
All right. Thank you, Jody. Well, kind of moving on, I know, Aisha, were you going to take the reins for a second? I know you might be our host for a moment.
I am. I'm switching gears and turning into moderator. And so, Nicole, I would actually ask you to provide us with an update on the housing affordability crisis and what we're seeing there.
Well, thank you, Aisha. We've already heard from Aisha and Jody about why we need to allow the federal eviction moratorium to expire. There are a lot of people hurting right now and are missing that money to help run their business. And from Jody's perspective, the need to have quick and effective distribution of rental assistance. I just want to come in here in the third part of our program and talk about the importance of these in keeping housing affordable and accessible in the long term, as we all sort of collectively begin to prepare for our post-pandemic future. As many renters know, housing affordability was and is a serious problem even pre-pandemic, but the imbalanced changes that we're seeing to housing laws right now, like I said, those drastic emergency mandates that were supposed to be temporary that are now putting a lot of pressure on everyone being semi-permanent, those changes could really tip the scales in the wrong direction from here as we recover from COVID, especially if rental assistance doesn't get to renters and housing providers for the folks who really need it. So my fiance, Andy, recently introduced me to the West Wing, and I know I'm several decades behind, but I'm going to use a line from the show, so bear with me for the reference, that you really have to look at the whole board. On the one hand, you have legislation that's, like we just talked about, drastic but temporary, is intended to keep renters stably housed during the emergency, like eviction moratoriums, calls to forcibly forgive rent or rent freeze restrictions. But really, we never anticipated that the public health crisis would last this long. We also have legislation that prevents any negative history from being included in consumer reports. Again, while well-intended, could hinder the ability of housing providers to sort of manage their risks from here. We've also got proposals that would restrict any collection of rental debt and calls for permanent rent controls, which would be very burdensome, not just on housing providers, but would have long-term impacts as well. And while these are, again, well-intentioned, we really need to think about the fact that this puts the financial burden solely on housing providers, while on the other side of the coin, you've got housing providers whose costs have, in some cases, drastically increased. We've seen that a lot in insurance premiums, also in terms of cleaning and maintenance, while so many more residents are living and working from home. And housing providers have really just had no breaks in terms of their mortgage, their property tax bills, just calling to mind that $400 billion number in tax payments that always remains due. They rely on rental income to pay their bills, as Jody said, to pay themselves and their employees a living wage. And the industry, this isn't that well known, but the industry was largely left out of business relief programs like the PPP, because the stimulus package that put that into place explicitly exempted a major portion of multifamily housing providers from getting relief. So yeah, just taking a look at the whole board, just to put that into context, we're more than a year into the pandemic. There are some renters who've been unable to pay their rent now for more than a year, and their outstanding rent debt, just take that for even one person, that could be tens of thousands of dollars. In areas where there have been a lot of sustained job losses, where areas where tourism kind of rules and those folks have been hardest hit, that could be hundreds of thousands of dollars that one housing provider is out and is in need of that income to be able to sustain their business and to maintain the housing for the rest of their community. I know I'd mentioned this stat before from the Mortgage Bankers Association that just for Q1, housing providers are looking at an $8 billion shortfall. And that is not something that can be taken lightly. As my colleague at NA likes to say, rent is the gas that sort of keeps the economy humming. And you really have to follow that dollar, as Jody said, to understand the real impact of significant rent shortfalls. So yeah, just kind of moving into talking about the cost of regulation. As I've kind of laid out that picture so far, these are significant challenges to the development of rental housing, in developing new supply, and in the management of rental housing. So if housing providers are unable to absorb these increased costs and think about the volume of those costs, that means that it'll have to be borne on overall increased housing costs for entire communities of renters to help rebalance that financial burden. So I hope this sort of paints a picture of the financial burdens that both sides are facing right now, with so much pressure falling on housing providers for more than a year now. And that's why it's so important, what Aisha and Jody and all the work that they do, for us to make sure that policymakers understand that from here on, we really need to focus on balanced and sustainable housing policies and leave these short-term emergency policies in COVID. So where do we go from here? Well, I am personally really optimistic for a brighter future. I don't know about all of you, but we continue to focus on supporting the industry with on-demand resources to help them through COVID and beyond, and even for renters as well, and educating policymakers on the news from the field that we're able to get from our state and local partners across the country and the lessons learned. But we really need to focus on leaving emergency housing policies behind and preparing for our post-pandemic lives. So what does that mean in terms of NAA's advocacy, just to give you a sort of a glimpse of our priorities? Well, we're very strongly supportive of legislation that makes some headway into that now becoming significant supply and demand imbalance, and to focus more on targeted housing assistance for low and moderate income renters who we know need more time to financially recover from COVID-19. And it's beyond the one-time boost of rental assistance with enhanced unemployment benefits possibly being lost at the end of the year. They're going to need more time to recover and will need longer-term housing assistance to keep them stable. With all this said, we also want to trust that state and local governments can do what they do best, which is to decide what housing policies best fit their needs and start to wind down eviction moratoriums, not just the federal one, but as we talked about with Aisha, the state and local versions of these policies as well. So in terms of supply, we are focused on a couple pieces of legislation that I just wanted to highlight today. The first is the Yes in My Backyard Act, the YIMBY Act, and the second is the Housing Supply and Affordability Act. The YIMBY Act for us is a really important one, and we talked about this at our Advocate conference. It focuses on the federal levers that can be used to incentivize state and local governments that receive federal dollars to incentivize them to reduce some of these barriers like NIMBYism and other costs of regulation that prevent affordable housing from being built. While the Housing Supply and Affordability Act, that really focuses on funding and technical assistance for state, local, and even sometimes regional bodies to help them invest in new housing construction, learn from lessons learned and formulate better housing plans and make affordably priced housing more accessible in the community. Our other primary focus is to support more robust investment in federal housing programs. And a couple come to mind that you probably already know, the LIHTC program, and importantly, the Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher Program, which we think is arguably the best tool in the toolbox for policymakers who want to help renters who need more time to recover, so that we can now focus on targeted assistance and move away from one-size-fits-all, federal policies. So what's to say about these programs? Well, for the Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher Program, we're really focused on legislation and policy change that better sets these programs up for success. Investing in more vouchers, in more program management and administration. I think for the Housing Choice Voucher Program, we're really hyper-focused on making that program function more like the standard leasing transaction, with less of that, bureaucratic red tape or other, bad juju that people think that the program has. So through program improvements and incentives, we really think that can increase voluntary housing provider participation in the program, and less focus on source of income mandates, but more focus on incentive-based legislation that streamlines the program and helps lead to better outcomes, not just for housing providers, but for residents overall. And that is more systemic long-term change. So I know there are many opportunities that we're a part of, or that we wanted to share with you in terms of how we're moving forward housing affordability solutions through Congress and supporting both the administration and Congress's ideas there. And we want to continue to be part of the solution to work together to solve this, what we all know is a really complicated puzzle in trying to solve the nation's housing affordability crisis. So from here, I think I'm going to turn the reins back over to Aisha as host for some questions. Aisha?
Yes, Nicole, you literally just gave us like an abundance of information in a short period of time. And so thank you for that. But I do have one question for you. Can you talk to us a little bit about the American Jobs Plan? Will that plan allow us an opportunity to make some long-term investments into the industry, like for the better?
Yeah, Aisha, thanks for that question. So the American Jobs Plan is the administration's $2 trillion with a T, $2 trillion infrastructure and jobs plan. And we continue to maintain that a large scale infrastructure package is really necessary to drive new investment in housing. I talked a little bit about the YIMBY Act and the other, supply focused pieces of legislation that we're supportive of and we're interested in. But if we want to focus on more transit-oriented development and more high-density development that may not be allowed right now in terms of zoning, we need to set up a plan or make investments that allow communities, that help communities by supporting them in their infrastructure locally, so that these communities can support the administration's sort of grand plans for reinvestments in housing and reinvestments in construction jobs and other jobs to help get us through the crisis. Oh, Aisha, actually, one more thing I was going to mention. In terms of sustainable housing, I know that's something that's high on President Biden's list as well. And that could equate to, large energy reduction requirements, or also retrofits for older buildings. And if that is also part of this idea of housing as infrastructure that's moving through Congress right now, we just want to make sure that that incentives or other ways for owners to offset those costs in terms of making possibly substantial retrofits in older buildings, to make sure that that's available to housing providers to make that possible.
Thank you so much, Nicole. I really appreciate it. I'm actually going to turn our show back over to you to close us out as we wind up on our time.
All right, perfect. Well, thank you, Aisha and Jody. This was a great conversation. I know I learned a lot. And, for my fellow speakers in closing, I was wondering if you two could share just a couple key takeaways. What would you like to leave our viewers with today?
Sure, I can start it off. So a key takeaway I would say for renters is to stay in communication with your housing provider. Housing providers are willing to work with the renters to establish payment plans, like I said previously, or assist you in your rental assistance application if needed. And for housing providers, stay active in your local associations. Local associations have established relationships with local officials and will have the most up-to-date information on any rental assistance programmatic changes that might occur in your area. So it's very important to stay plugged in locally to keep in the know.
Well, thank you, Jody. Aisha?
Yeah, absolutely. So my key takeaways today would be we're keeping an eye out on these cases that are challenging the CDC's eviction moratorium. Even at the end of the moratorium, like when it expires, these cases will still be in litigation. And so NAA will continue to track these cases and participate as friends of the court in these cases as we support the housing industry going forward.
Well, thank you both, and thanks for everything you do to support the industry. I guess if I were to have one takeaway in closing as well, just supporting what Aisha and Jody are saying about us exploring every option to make sure we're supporting the industry through these times, and Jody and I wearing our advocacy hats. We want to make sure that if you are a member of the local or state apartment association or NAA, you really do take the time to share your story with a member of Congress or even a state or local official. That really hits closer to home. It means more in their minds and really sticks when they're considering how to pursue legislation next. So on that note, thank you again. And if there are any questions that we didn't get to or that come to mind, please do email communications@naahq.org. Again, that's communications@naahq.org. And thanks again to our panelists and to everyone who tuned in. I hope you enjoyed today's session, and please do keep an eye out for future roundtables. See you next time. Thank you.